Kantian morality, which we examined in the last lecture, stands in stark contrast to the moral philosophy of utilitarianism, first formulated by the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And yet, in the end, both moral theories are unconvincing for exactly the same reason. Bentham's moral theory is laid out in his well-known Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, which begins with an explanation of what Bentham considers the central axiom of all moral reasoning, namely the principle of utility. Whereas Bentham often describes this principle as requiring us to pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what he really means by happiness is nothing more than pleasure. So central to Bentham's thought is the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain that he begins his introduction with the following stark claim, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects, are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we make to throw off their subjugation will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it." End of quote. Simply put, pleasure is the only thing for Bentham that is unqualifiedly good, just as pain is the only thing that is unqualifiedly bad. So a utilitarian might say that friendship or political tranquility are also good, but only to the extent that people take pleasure in friendship, or that political tranquility is a condition for pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain more effectively. By contrast, no one pursues pleasure for the sake of anything beyond pleasure itself. And in this respect, for Bentham, pleasure is utterly unique. To be sure, Bentham is aware that many people at least claim to pursue things other than pleasure as ends in themselves, such as virtue, holiness, or wisdom, those kinds of goods especially recommended to us by Aristotle, Aquinas, and the natural law tradition. Bentham scoffs at such people and considers them to be suffering from a deeply regrettable delusion. A religious person, for example, might pretend to prefer holiness over pleasure, but in fact he's only pursuing pleasure by different means. This is because, according to Bentham, the religious person is merely exchanging opportunities for temporal or worldly pleasure for what he takes to be the much greater pleasure of the afterlife. Likewise, because of his irrational beliefs in an angry and capricious God, the religious person is happy to impose pain on himself and others in order to avoid the far greater pain of eternal damnation. As Bentham scornfully argues, therefore, although the religious person considers himself fundamentally different from worldly or hedonistic men, the religious ultimately value pleasure as their greatest good, no less than anyone else. It is in this respect, then, that Bentham considers human beings as subject to the sovereign masters of pleasure and pain. Moreover, Bentham seems to understand his own role of moral philosopher as that of getting us to recognize this subjugation while freely and openly ordering our lives according to the pursuit of pleasure alone. This is where the principle of utility comes in, which is plainly stated by Bentham as follows. Quote, "By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness, which is to say, for Bentham, pleasure, of the party whose interest is in question, or, what is the same thing in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness," again, which is the same thing for Bentham as pleasure. On this analysis, the morality of all human actions is rooted in their foreseeable consequences for increasing or decreasing the fundamental utilitarian good of pleasure. If the foreseeable consequences of an action cause more pain than pleasure, that action is morally unjustified. Likewise, if the foreseeable consequences of an action cause more pleasure than pain, but could have caused even more pleasure still by means of an alternative action, that action is also unjustified. So, for example, spending the day helping a friend move would be the cause of pleasure. But if on that same day another friend is moving who is in greater need of my help, helping the first friend move might be morally wrong from the utilitarian perspective, because I would have created more pleasure by helping the second friend. In the final analysis, Bentham argues that the morality of our actions can only be determined by asking ourselves which of those actions will result in the greatest net gain of pleasure for all those affected by it. To be sure, forecasting all the consequences and ripple effects of our actions is difficult, even impossible. But this doesn't remove our obligation to determine the greatest pleasure for the greatest number to the best of our limited ability. According to the utilitarian, then, it's just nonsense to speak of actions that are inherently wrong or intrinsically good. There are only actions with good, bad, better, or worse consequences. Interestingly, Bentham is aware that those who speak of actions as inherently or intrinsically right or wrong often do so from the perspective of the Aristotelian and Thomistic traditions, and especially that of natural law. But instead of confronting these arguments of natural law on their own terms, Bentham redescribes natural law and other such moralities as having adopted what he calls the, quote, principle of sympathy and antipathy. Instead of judging the morality of actions on the basis of their good or bad consequences, according to the principle of utility, adherents of the principle of sympathy and antipathy irrationally base their judgments on emotion. More specifically, such people approve or disapprove of actions for no good reason at all, which is to say merely because they feel inclined to approve or disapprove of those actions. For this reason, Bentham chortles that the principle of sympathy and antipathy is a principle, quote, in name rather than in reality. Again, Bentham considers natural law theories as falling under this exact category, which is a good example of his tendency to offer wild mischaracterizations of moral theories that he just doesn't like. His understanding of natural law theory amounts to nothing more than someone who calls an action unnatural merely because he feels a sense of aversion when considering it. When asked to explain why a certain action is unnatural and therefore immoral, beyond merely one's own revulsion, Bentham is confident that all thoughtful persons will end up appealing back to his own inescapable principle of utility. Utilitarianism has been justly criticized in a number of ways, but there are three reasons why adherents of natural law theory, especially those coming from a Thomistic perspective, should find this morality especially objectionable. First, utilitarianism holds, almost by definition, that the ends justify the means. When we couple that position with the claim that the only thing possessing any real value is the experience of pleasure, we end up with some alarming, even grisly conclusions. Contemporary philosopher Peter Singer is probably the foremost utilitarian thinker today, and he's very good, though not inerrant, at following utilitarian principles wherever they happen to lead. For example, Singer argues that abortion should be available to women throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, and this stems from his utilitarian view that only the experience of pleasure has value. Human life, therefore, has no value in and of itself. If a mother's net gain of pleasure in having an abortion outweighs her child's net loss of pleasure in being killed, that abortion is perfectly justifiable. Reasoning consistently, Singer further allows that killing children need not be restricted to the time before birth. Young infants may also be killed if the pain and inconvenience of parenthood outweighs whatever brief pain an infant may suffer in being murdered. Presumably, Singer would compassionately recommend that we killed the child painlessly whenever possible. As Singer rightly points out, pleasure and pain are not experienced with the same acuity in beings that possess little or no self-awareness. And so late-term abortion and infanticide are actually more justifiable than killing other adult mammals like cows and pigs. Killing those people in severe states of mental incapacity at the end of life is also justifiable, maybe even praiseworthy. An elderly man in a coma has no value in and of himself. On Singer's utilitarianism, the only value one could conceivably have is a value for oneself or for others. These observations are not offered as refutations of utilitarianism. Those already sympathetic to an Aristotelian or Thomistic natural law basis of morality will surely take Singer's shocking conclusions as a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. But just by themselves, they don't show us exactly what is wrong. For that, we must first examine more closely the utilitarian claim that pleasure is the greatest good. In fact, the only true good. Remember, this is the claim that Bentham makes at the outset of his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, and one for which he offers no argument because he wrongly thinks it's just self-evident. Utilitarians, of course, are not the first ones to believe this. Moralities based on hedonism were actually common in the ancient world, so common that Aristotle devoted considerable effort to refuting this position in his celebrated Nicomachean Ethics. As Aristotle was aware, most people, even if they don't say so, live as though bodily pleasure was their greatest good. The sad truth, then, is that most human beings are unable to pursue a happiness that is uniquely human at all, but they rather live lives of, quote, utter slavishness in their preference for a life suitable to cattle. But more to the point, Aristotle maintains further that identifying pleasure as the greatest good is philosophically indefensible. As he argues, pleasure is something that is added to the activities in which we engage, such as eating, drinking, listening to music, or studying. To be sure, different people take pleasure in some things more than others, but it tells us very little for someone to say that the goal of life is pleasure in some generic sense, since pleasures vary in kind as widely as the activities in which pleasure is taken. In the famous Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Conan the Barbarian, when an admiring young woman asked an intoxicated Conan, "I suppose nothing hurts you," he responded, "Only pain." We find this line humorous because of its meaninglessness. It's the kind of thing that maybe Yogi Berra might have said. But upon reflection, it would be just as meaningless to say that what one desires most is pleasure. As we have seen, according to Aristotle, the real question is not what activities are the most pleasurable. This will just vary from person to person. But what activities are highest, best, or most befitting to our human nature. It will follow that the pleasure we take in those activities will be the highest and most sublime pleasures. But even at that, it would be a mistake to say that the pleasure is our primary reason for engaging in those activities. We engage in the highest activities available to us as human beings because they are highest. The pleasure we experience in doing so, so to speak, is the icing on the cake. Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and Peter Singer would reject Aristotle's argument, because they do not acknowledge any such thing as higher or lower activities for human nature. For them, as for many modern moralists, human nature just has no purpose or natural trajectory, and cannot therefore be perfected in any meaningful sense of the word. This brings us to the final and most devastating criticism of utilitarianism. According to its proponents, pleasure is the one and only unqualified good. And yet, in arguing this, there is no attempt to demonstrate that morality, as they define it, is itself good. any real goodness that it has would have to be derived from the pleasure we experience in being moral. And yet utilitarians all agree that whether we take pleasure in morality is beside the point in determining our actual moral obligations. To put it more sharply, utilitarians have no good answer to the question as to why I should care about maximizing anyone's pleasure or minimizing anyone's pain other than my own. They are therefore just as unable as Kantians to answer the fundamental question, why be moral? The only response they can muster is, because you have a moral obligation to be moral. But as with Kantians, there is no attempt made to provide a reason as to why, in the first place, we should live up to our moral obligations, however those moral obligations might be derived. Thus, with utilitarianism, we have a complete separation of the right from the good. And as a result, the utilitarian cannot provide a good answer to a man such as Glaucon in Plato's Republic, who understands that morality must be good for the moral person to be anything worth taking seriously. Although Jeremy Bentham seems to be entirely oblivious to this problem with utilitarianism, contemporary utilitarians, such as Peter Singer, are rightly bothered by it. Singer, in fact, admits that the point of his moral philosophy is not to show that morality is good for the moral person, but rather to show what is moral and immoral once we have already decided that morality is worthwhile. The most he can offer the moral skeptic, a man like Thrasymachus from Plato's Republic, is that living a moral life is able to provide us with a sense of meaning or purpose, of which an entirely selfish life is devoid. And yet Singer acknowledges that not everyone may require a sense of meaning or purpose in order to be happy. So for them, the point is just moot. And even for those who do derive a sense of meaning from acting morally, we must remember that on utilitarianism, this is entirely incidental to what our moral obligations actually are. Moreover, any sense of meaning we may get from living morally, on Singer's definition, is entirely subjective. There simply is no room for any objective meaning or purpose to human life in the utilitarian schema. As Singer puts it, quote, "When we reject belief in a God, we must give up the idea that life on this planet has some preordained meaning. Life as a whole has no meaning. Life began, as the best available theories tell us, in a chance combination of molecules. It then evolved through random mutation and natural selection. All of this just happened, and it did not happen for any overall purpose." End of quote. What this brief statement reveals is that the only sense of meaning Singer can offer the moral person is an admittedly delusional one. Only a confused person can have a sense of meaning while simultaneously affirming that his life has no meaning. What Singer means by meaning is nothing more than a subjective goal to be pursued. But he gives us no reason to think that morality should be a more worthwhile subjective goal than counting blades of grass or collecting stamps. Stamp collecting is actually Singer's own example, and the only reason he gives us not to make it our life's purpose is that we might grow out of it, thus admitting his inability to demonstrate why we should grow out of it. It's probably not incidental that Singer's unsuccessful attempt to provide compelling reasons for us to live morally comes during one of his most famous books' only reference to the natural law tradition. As we've seen, this tradition does not only argue that morality is necessary for the happiness of the moral person, but that morality is nothing other than the voluntary actions and habits of character that are necessary to live a genuinely happy life. Singer acknowledges that this viewpoint has existed, quote, ever since Plato, and among philosophers who, quote, made broad claims about human nature and the conditions under which human beings can be happy. As if to strengthen his argument, Singer further complains that such a view rests upon the existence of God, and dismisses it entirely without argument by saying that, quote, philosophers cannot use this argument if they want to carry conviction nowadays, because doing so involves the adoption of, quote, sweeping psychological theories on the basis of their own general experience of their fellows, as philosophers used to do when psychology was a branch of philosophy, end of quote. It's bad enough that Singer assumes without argument that the arguments for the existence of God are unconvincing. His more egregious claim is that this tradition is based on sweeping psychological theories rooted in nothing but subjective experience. As anyone going through this course in philosophy can see, these remarks by Singer are nothing more than a casual, even sweeping, dismissal of a 2,500-year-old tradition of philosophy with which he just can't be bothered to engage.